Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's American Community Media Weekly National Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, your moderator for today and co-producer of our weekly Friday briefings with my colleague Sunita Sorachi. After nearly 2 years of war between Israel and Hamas, Gaza is in ruins. Over 60,000 people have been killed, 18,000 of them children, according to UNICEF. The majority of Gaza's 2 million residents have been displaced, left without home, clean water, or consistent access to food. For months, many have faced what international agencies now describe as catastrophic levels of hunger. Despite repeated denials by Israeli officials, the global consensus is clear. Gaza is on the brink of famine. Religious leaders, humanitarian groups, and global heads of state, including even President Donald Trump, have acknowledged that starvation is taking place. UNICEF, the UN Fund for Children's Emergencies, last week called for more humanitarian and commercial traffic to come into Gaza, calling for flooding the strip with supplies, using all channels and all gates to combat the spiraling death rates that accompany the 8 blockades, the war, and the hunger. This is a critical conversation. Thank you for being here. We want to explore the roots of this crisis, the conditions on the ground, and what must be done to protect the lives of Gaza's children and families. Our speakers today are Alex DeWall. He's Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, expert on famine and mass atrocity. And he's also a research professor at Tufts University. Budur Hassan, she's Amnesty International's researcher on Israel and Palestine. And Afif Nizuli is a journalist and aid worker, just returned from 9 weeks volunteering in Gaza. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, and we encourage our speakers to answer questions there throughout the conference if and when they can. We ask speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters, like I'm doing. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. Today, we will have a Q&A session separately with every one of our panelists, and then we'll take your questions after each speaker. So place them in the chat so I can see them, and we'll take them as time permits. Later this afternoon, we will send the video and the expanded bios. So today, we are pleased to welcome Alex DeWall. He's Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, a professor at Tufts University, and he's an expert in famine. We are very lucky to have him. He's a very important expert. Welcome, Mr. DeWall. For those of us who don't know how this process of a whole society, when a whole society is unable to get enough food, can you explain how Gaza came to this point where people, particularly children, the frail and the old, are starving?
So thank you for inviting me to this. It's good to be with you. I'm sorry that it's such a dismal subject to talk about. And for those of you who are from Gaza or have relatives there, my condolences, my commiserations for the suffering that your families are going through. So before October of 2023, the situation in Gaza was unusual. The nutrition and health status of the population was generally good. You didn't have large numbers of malnourished children. You had high rates of vaccination, high rates of health coverage. But you had a situation in which the population of about 2 million people was almost entirely dependent upon supplies of food, medicine, water, fuel, etc., that were under the control of Israel. There was very little food that was actually produced within Gaza. After October the 7th, Israel did 2 things. It put a complete siege on Gaza, not allowing anything in for the first 7 weeks. And after that, a partial siege, allowing some food and other commodities in, day by day, varying the amount that it would allow in. And it also launched a military campaign from the air and on the ground, that attacked and destroyed objects indispensable to survival. And that is a key term because in international law, the prohibition on starvation is not food as such. It is defined as objects indispensable to survival. That includes food, water, sanitation, housing, medical care, etc. And there was mass displacement. There were evacuation orders for the population, so people had to leave their homes and were crowded into areas that were desperately overcrowded. Now, for the 13 months from November of 2023 to December of 2024, we have data from a mechanism. It's called the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System. It was set up just over 20 years ago by the United Nations to measure the level of humanitarian need in crisis-affected areas. And it draws on 3 different types of data. Food security data, that is what people are eating and what they are doing in order to eat that food. Child malnutrition, and evidence for excess deaths. And it has 5 levels. So normal, stressed, crisis, emergency, and then the worst level, famine or catastrophe. And what we saw between November of 2023 and December of 2024 was the population going right up to the famine level, but not quite breaking it. And on several occasions when the IPC, and there's an American equivalent called FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System Network, when the IPC and FuseNet warned that these famine thresholds were about to be broken, the United States pushed Israel to provide more assistance and kept it just below that threshold. I would also add that Israel did not permit the collection of all the data that is necessary. So in not allowing journalists in there and not allowing humanitarian workers to collect all the data, as it were, it could play the game with the data and prevent information from being available to give that famine determination. Now, what we've had in the last few months is a worsening of this. So a complete siege, so a complete collapse in food availability. And that began at the beginning of March. And in the middle of May, some food was allowed in. But by that time, the food stocks had got so low that you needed not only to give enough food to feed everyone, you really needed to give more. And one of the reasons for that is that there's always an unequal distribution of food. It's the poorest 20%, the poorest quarter that are really at risk. And they are the last ones to get food from the market or general distribution. So what we've seen in the last few months is really a catastrophic decline. And the IPC system, what they actually said a couple of weeks ago, I forget, 10 days ago now, was they said the worst case scenario of famine is unfolding. And what they meant by that was we don't actually have the precise data, but we are sufficiently experienced in observing these situations to infer from the data that we have that this is what is happening. It is like when you walk into to meet your doctor and you have a high fever, the doctor doesn't need to send for the tests to ascertain that you are very sick. He or she can give the diagnosis right there. So the last point I'll make now is that what you see in these situations is it gets worse and worse and worse gradually, and then it escalates. And we're at that point of escalation. And what I fear is that as that escalation kicks in, as the numbers of children in particular who are starving increase so rapidly every day, it will be that much harder to stabilize the situation, to return it to normal.
Thank you, Mr. DeWall. I know that at this point, after there was 2 months of blockade between March and May, right? Where they were not allowing anything in. And then due to international pressure, I guess, they created this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that is distributing food, but this is a Israel-US institution or whatever you want to call it. So it hasn't really worked out too well, has it?
So it's not a system that any professional humanitarian would set up. So the basic principle of a humanitarian operation is that you take assistance to where people are and you provide the most needy with what they most need. And you particularly target children. And what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has done is the United Nations had about 400 locations, and it had a reliable system. So that system allowed people, gave people the confidence that they, even if they were not getting food today, they would get it tomorrow because the system was embedded with the community. What the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has is 4 sites, and they are far away. Particularly 3 of them are in the far south of Gaza, and they're far away, and people have to go there. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation calls them secure distribution sites. Well, they are secure only insofar as the food, the items are secure up to the point where they reach that place. There is no security for the people. More than 800 have been killed in trying to get it. I can't tell you whether they've been killed deliberately or it's simply a matter of when you have these huge crowds of people rushing to get the food from a place that is only open for a few minutes. If you have a soldier nearby, he doesn't know who's in that crowd. It could be Hamas, and they can easily panic. Or the mercenaries, the private security contractors there could also panic. And so the poor and vulnerable cannot get this food. It's the strong that get the food. And one point I think is very crucial about this, which is that Israel says it set this up because it did not want Hamas to get its hands on food. Now, and it had been alleging for months that Hamas was stealing food. We know from US government investigations that Hamas was not stealing food at scale. I'm sure that individual Hamas members may have been eating it, but they were not taking it at scale. The US has its reports on that. The New York Times called up Israeli colonels, senior military officers, and they confirmed this. And the UN had a system of very close tracking of all its aid commodities that would ensure they reached the people, including following up. Now, if you look at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and you look at the young men who are storming those places to take the food, nobody knows who they are. They could be Hamas, they could be armed gangs. And what this tells me is either this is really just, frankly, incompetent, or Israel doesn't care about this issue of Hamas taking food. There is some other reason behind it. I can't answer that question. But I think if you talk to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, one question you must ask is, who is eating your food? Because I don't believe they can answer that question.
Thank you. Well, it's time to go to the chat to get some questions from the reporters. I think some of the questions are probably more likely to be for the other panelists. So for example, Sunita Kusarachi, my colleague, had a question. Sunita?
Thank you, Pilar. Professor DeWall, this might be a bit of a naive question, but I'll ask it nonetheless. Traveling to food aid sites, as you mentioned, is dangerous for Gazans, and airdrops are somewhat fungible. It's unclear as to who's actually going to get the food. Could aid workers go door to door to directly to food refugee camps or door to door to distribute food and necessary supplies to ensure some level of accountability?
So I think Afif can probably answer that more precisely than I can.
So that's exactly what the UN-backed system that had 400 locations used to do. That was the way that it worked. That is what has been replaced. Hot meals delivered straight to people in red zones, community kitchens that were really backed and forwarded by Palestinians themselves. I even volunteered there while I was there. I was there from March 27th to June 3rd. A big loss is that these community kitchens now have no supplies to work with. On June 1st, I was at a community kitchen called Shabeb Gaza, who had just recently had shut down and had let another NGO sort of take over the kitchen, and all they had to work with were potatoes. So it's really about understanding that the system that was cleared out used to have literally, quite literally, I think 100 times more locations. Are 4 semi-operational GHF death trap sites versus the UN-backed location community kitchens and aid sites that were in the hundreds. And so like humanitarian aid workers really were doing that. And now they can't do that because there are no supplies to do it with. And just to back sort of and align myself with what Alex was saying, these systems wouldn't be put in place by humanitarian aid workers, these GHF sites as they are, because they're very dangerous, disorganized, and require a lot of, there's the mechanisms which make them work are not human, they're not of the ethos of humanitarianism, of equality and neutrality. They're really like sort of set up, in my opinion, purely as another wing and another strategy of sort of eradicating and really bringing a lot of pain to the people rather than relief.
Thank you, Afif. Let's go to the chat again. Henrietta, do you want to ask your question, please? Henrietta Burroughs, and identify
Yes.
your media organization, please.
Yes, thanks so much. East Palo Alto today. The Israeli government announced today that it would take over Gaza. What do you think of this announcement? Will this action exacerbate the current problems for Gaza residents? And is the current food system, was it set up to fail?
Gaza City, you meant. They said they were going to take over Gaza City. Yeah. Alex?
I think the answer to both those questions is yes. I think it is going to be truly a disaster. I mean, the people of Gaza have been pushed, I wouldn't say to the brink, they've been pushed beyond the brink. And to force them to be displaced one more time, and without any viable form of safety net of assistance, it's a disaster. And I would make one point actually in addition, picking up on what Afif said. The core principle of humanitarianism, the first principle is the principle of humanity. And I mean, I've worked on the issue of famine, not as a physician, but as a social anthropologist and aid worker for more than 40 years. And one of the key points about famine is it's also a social phenomenon. And as a social observer, I would say the moment when you really see famine is when, instead of a family being able to share bread, break bread together, they fight for bread. When you get that breakdown, that is, as it were, the dividing line between what it is to be a human and what it is to be an animal. And I have on my bookshelf here, I have a dozen books which are memoirs about famine from Bengal in India, from the siege of Leningrad, from the Dutch hunger winter, from all in history, from Ireland, etc. And one of the things that really comes out very strongly is the sense of humiliation, dehumanization that comes with starvation, when you are forced to behave not like a human being, treating others with respect, but competing, but doing dehumanizing things. And this isn't just a sort of spin-off. This is really central to what the experience is. In fact, just my last point on this, when I did my own field research in the 1980s in Sudan, the people of Sudan who were going through famine, in their own understanding, famine was partly, it was a threat to their lives or the lives of their children, but fundamentally it was a threat to a way of life. They saw it as as the destruction of their dignified community. And if they couldn't have that, that really was what famine was doing. So when I see the reports and I listen to people from Gaza, and I hear these words about humiliation, dehumanization, etc., this really resonates with with everything that we, as social scientists, historians, social anthropologists, how we understand famine.
Thank you. There are so many questions in the chat. I hope we have time to take them on after everyone speaks. I wanted to introduce our next speaker, Budur Hassan. She's an Amnesty International researcher on Israel and Palestine, and she joins us from Ramallah. Ms. Hassan, thank you for being with us today. Can you briefly explain what your job as a researcher for Amnesty International entails, and what are you hearing from people regarding the hunger, the starvation?
Yeah. So apologies for not being able to turn on my camera for internet connection problems.
Yes.
We at Amnesty have been investigating the situation. I myself, as an Amnesty researcher, have been investigating and documenting the situation in Palestine since 2022. I think the first thing I've worked on was a 3-day attack offensive by the Israeli forces on Gaza. That was 49 people were killed on those 3 days. And one sentence I think that continued to haunt me, and I felt like it was prophetic when everything restarted, in a sense, was one father whose child was seriously injured in a drone strike. He said, "This time we survived. We don't know what would happen next. We don't know if you'll find us alive next." Unfortunately, I have not been able to reestablish contact with this person. But just to say that what Professor DeWall mentioned about the situation in Gaza, even prior to the 7th of October being really bad in terms of at least Israel controlling, restricting entry and supply of food, but also I think that the situation that we've been seeing since then has been unprecedented for Palestinians, at least in terms of scale. But it's something that we've been seeing some manifestations of over a period of time, for decades, really. And now we're seeing the worst, really. But in terms of what I'm hearing from people, so we at Amnesty published a report stating that Israel was committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza back in December 2024. And that was based on one pattern of conduct of Israeli forces in Gaza, and also a plethora of statements that we analyzed. We analyzed over 100 statements made by Israeli officials whose role is instrumental and very important to the continuation of the military operations in Gaza. And we focused at the time on 3 acts: killing members of the group, injuring seriously mentally or bodily harming members of the group, but also deliberately inflicting on the group's condition of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. And one of the things, when we were studying the patterns of inflicting on the group conditions of life, we were precisely focusing on this deadly mix of hunger and disease. At one point, especially in February and March 2024, that was most tangible and visible in the north of the Gaza Strip, the area from which people were ordered out very early during the genocide, but around hundreds of thousands still remained. And we were seeing how there were even more severe restrictions on entry of food and entry of medical supplies, and more stringent blockade being imposed specifically on the area of northern Gaza. Although obviously difficulties accessing food were pervasive in all of Gaza at the time, but the situation in the north was particularly bad. And early then, in February and March, we were seeing some scenes of what people came to define as the flour massacres, people, Israeli forces allowing trucks carrying flour and other types of aid or commercial supplies entering Gaza very early at dawn, around 4 a.m. People in their thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, waiting for the trucks. And then once the truck would approach, starved, desperate people, some of them at that point in northern Gaza had to resort to eating animal feed, started rushing to get that aid. And at that time, it was clear to us that there was this process of dehumanization taking place. And people really described it quite painfully to us about, first of all, the breakdown of social fabric, because Gaza traditionally, we're talking about a very tight-knit communities of people, and we're talking about a community, a society where it's very small, and because of Israeli blockade, it's very closed. Many people, especially people who are 18 and younger, probably never even left Gaza. The majority of those who were born after 2006 never even left Gaza in their entire lives. So people, everyone from the edge to the edge, almost everyone would know each other in terms of families. It's very close. We're talking about a very small area of 365 square kilometers, very tight family connections. So the first instinct of people when they see someone in need is to help each other. There is this very strong social fabric, cohesion, togetherness, communal aid. But then you start seeing the changes to the society once this threat, once the need to individually survive or to save the family starts taking over, and people start thinking of how we can save this for our families. And then the fight over the very meager resources allowed in starts kicking in. Now, during the ceasefire, the very brief window of hope, that people started trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. And again, I don't want to draw a pink or real flowery picture of what was happening during this fire. It was an incredibly challenging, emotionally searing period for Gaza's Palestinian population. That ceasefire, which lasted from the January to the 18th of March. But at least people were trying, literally, as they were digging up for the remains of their loved ones buried there for months and they not being able to access it, as they started going back to the north, to the rubble of their homes, starting rebuilding something from scratch, they were also looking for hope and hoping that, yeah, this would be over. At least we would start thinking of how we can rebuild our lives. And at that time, aid was allowed in more. Obviously, Israel still continued to deny the entry of heavy machinery necessary for reconstruction, necessary for the removal of rubble. Israel continues to deny the entry of makeshift housing, of people couldn't start rebuilding their homes. So there was that, and there were areas designed as part of the no-go military zones, which residents could not go into, and these often included some of Gaza's most fertile agricultural lands, especially on the eastern side. This was part of the expanded buffer zone, but still, somehow, people found a way to create life out of lifelessness and to look forward and to start planning for something other than death. And then then at that time, on the 2nd of March, Israel established a total siege. Like, we're talking about total siege, nothing getting in. A week later, Israel cut off the only operational desalination plant which was connected to the electricity grid that comes from Israel, but obviously the money for its supply is paid by the Palestinian Authority. Israel disconnected it from the electricity grid, the main water desalination plant. And there was obviously the difficulty of accessing clean water because of the destruction of the water and sanitation infrastructure, with which Professor DeWall referenced when he spoke about the destruction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And we started seeing, because at the time when the total siege was imposed on the 2nd of March, people still had, there was the supplies of what was allowed to get in, the trucks that were allowed to get in. So we started feeling the devastating conditions first when the war returned, because the 18th of March, the re-escalation of the genocide was one of the most horrific nights that Palestinians in Gaza ever lived, in terms of hospitals being overcrowded with people who were injured. We were talking about massively disproportionate and discriminate attacks on civilian housing, which left hundreds, just on the first that day, more than 400 people, over 180 of whom were children, were killed on just one night. And then, but in terms of the impact of when we started feeling that, yes, there is a real fear that starvation may start kicking in, and not just in the north, was early April. We started receiving reports. We started interviewing doctors, especially working at pediatricians, doctors working at at some of the stabilization centers in the hospitals across Gaza City in particular. Mass displacement orders. Israel started again, resumed the issuing of mass displacement orders. And when we're talking about mass displacement orders, we're not just saying that people are ordered to move from one place to another. We're talking about people ordered to move from one place to another under the threat of bombardment and forced to leave behind everything, including sources of food production, including medical supplies, including baby formula. And then in April, we started receiving calls, appeals from parents whose children infants in particular, were struggling for food, struggling to get baby formula. Many of the supplies that began entering were running out. And obviously that's the combination of this, and then those in the warlords, those who would, as happens in every single war conflict all over the world, that you will have this class that would want to benefit from the imposition of the blockade, either starting hoarding or selling at exorbitant prices. And this, the peak and the escalation of the starvation and its impact continued in concomitantly. At the same time, what Israel did was really interesting. It began raising areas across the eastern parts of Gaza, including Shuja'iyya in the east of Gaza City, Beit Lahia, north of Gaza City, Beit Hanun, and the area of eastern Khan Yunis. These, we're talking about some of, again, Gaza's most fertile agricultural land, the main where people plant crops. Many greenhouses were destroyed exactly at the time that starvation reached its worst, that the denial of the entry of food continued. People at that time were kind of comforting themselves with the idea that at least we could access some of our tomatoes, at least we could access some of our vegetables, and that's what kept vegetables in the market. Okay, there is no meat. Some people could go rely on the fishermen who would really run huge risks just to fish, because it's very dangerous. It was dangerous even before the genocide for fishermen to try to get fish, but particularly after, because the real rich fishing areas were off limits for them, so they had to be close always to the port. Grazing lands or poultry farms were mostly destroyed by Israel, so that left people at least trying to get some vegetables. Some people planted, people who had seeds entering tried to, there were some initiatives by farmers in order to alleviate the impact of starvation. All of this also was in tatters because of Israel's deliberate raising. And I'm saying deliberate because we're talking about areas that Israel had full military control over, and yet it began raising what had remained of these areas using heavy machinery or just manually laid explosives to destroy these areas. And even when the total siege ended, or let's say it was eased on the 19th of May 2025, after nearly 78 days of total siege, what we saw is immediately it was replaced by this militarized aid system, which again was the question: was it designed to fail? I think it was not only is it true that it was designed to fail, but it was also designed to be a part of this engineered starvation, because everything, it's a process. It's not something that, we're not speaking about things that happened by chance or a combination of unfortunate consequences of something, okay, it can, or recklessness. There was nothing reckless There is especially, recklessness is a claim you can say about one airstrike here, one airstrike there. You can maybe, or 10 or 100, obviously not thousands, but you can use recklessness to try to justify or at least remove the deliberate nature, try to obscure the deliberate nature of the campaign. But when it comes to all of these things coming together, the establishment of this deadly militarized aid scheme system, which every single reputable, trusted organization said that it would never have succeeded. That if the flaws of the system were very clear from even when the discussion was of these plans months before they came to fruition, everyone decided, because this system doesn't, even if we want to give whatever initiative that was put in plan the benefit of the doubt, the very fact that you would only put 4 mini operational aid distribution centers, that you would choose to put them all south of Wadi Gaza, that you would all very far from the population, that you would order people to come without any sense, even though they have the data, they can they can use the data, they can find a dignified way to distribute food. They did nothing of that, and people then are asked within the span of 10-15 minutes barely to start rushing and competing with one another over scraps of food, over packages or boxes of food. And then they have so many people we've talked to said we felt like animals, and it's not a metaphor, because some people were even on the floor trying to get some food or what had remained or what was dispersed. Some people would just get their box of flour. Literally, some of the flour that they got was tarnished with blood, the blood of people who were shot by the Israeli forces. So all of sorry.
Yes. When you finish, and I'm going to move on to the next speaker, and then we're going to get to questions, because
lastly, I'm sorry it took so long, because there is this very complex process. Lastly, I just want to focus on 2 testimonies, just to amplify how desperate the situation is and how we're not talking about something that's going to end now, because starvation doesn't end in the moment that more food is allowed in, because we're talking about a completely devastating health sector system. Now we're seeing how there is the spread of the Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, which is also partly a result of overcrowding triggered by diarrhea, which is spreading, meningitis is spreading. But there was one, and so all these illnesses, in order to start the process of treatment, you need a functional healthcare sector, which is not available in Gaza, and which is not going to be resolved if more trucks enter. It needs, there must be a ceasefire for this to even start working. But just one, because I'm very keen, I'm very keen on listening to the other speakers, just to end with one testimony from a woman who is breastfeeding her 4-month infant. And obviously, in addition to explain to us how guilty she feels of even having given birth, she described, and she has a 3-year-old baby in addition. And she said something that for her, what breaks her, she says, I am weak before my children. I can't hear their cries. Once I had to beat my child to sleep because he was crying so hard, and there was nothing I could do to help him. We spent 3 days without having any type of food because the community kitchen at our IDP camp was no longer functioning. My husband, she says, went to seek aid because that was the only option, and he returned injured. And I told him, what's the point of you getting injured or disabled, and then we would have another burden on us? And then she's describing all of us and says, we don't feel like the world sees us as human. And this sentence, when you hear it from someone in Gaza, we don't feel like the world sees us as human, I think it captures everything.
Yes. Thank you, Badur. Thank you so much for this first person. I mean, you actually talk to people, you know what you're talking about. Thank you for coming to share this with us. I wanted to move quickly to Afif Nessouli. He's a journalist that volunteers as an aid worker and recently spent 9 weeks in Gaza delivering aid, as well as reporting in his off time. Afif, I had questions for you, but I'm just gonna let you go on and tell us, what do you feel you need to say at this point of your experience when you were
So
there?
I just want to absolutely substantiate everything that Budur and Alex have said. Budur just gave us an extremely well, sort of a very good example of what I saw in person. I was there from March 27th to June 3rd. So by March 27th, people were rationing food. People were already hungry. I had a friend who had already lost 85 pounds, around nearly by now it's probably 100. He had gone from a larger man to a man with a face that is gaunt. I published all of this in The Intercept, and you guys can see pictures of him. I have a friend who's at 6 feet tall at 119 pounds. He is struggling because he can never find calories. Not everybody is given the same amount of privileges. So just to give you some clarity, I went in as a aid worker with GLIA. GLIA has been in Gaza for decades. I had been reporting on Gaza with The Intercept, and I had gotten so many sources and so many contacts before I had actually gone to Gaza. And one of them had HIV and has HIV and is in the north and needed medication. What is little known is that the Hamas, quote unquote, Hamas run Ministry of Health was actually providing him HIV medication every 3 months for free for a long time. And he still gets that medication, but for the depots were being bombed. It was very, very touch and go. It was hard to know whether he would be able to get more medication. So he reached out asking for sort of any coordinating help. And then as I published stories on him on social media anonymously, GLIA got in touch with me, said that they could probably get a convoy of medication to him in Gaza City. And that kind of began the relationship between the two of them and my reporting of them. And then GLIA eventually asked if I would, consider volunteering as a logistics coordinator, since I had some experience coordinating already in Gaza, and they would totally understand if I wanted to report on in the off hours, but absolutely couldn't sort of say that out loud while I was there, because I was just sort of a humanitarian aid worker, and Palestinian journalists were doing the job that I didn't need to do their job for them. What we needed was people on the ground helping. So with everything that you've heard today, I can substantiate that with doctors at Nasser and Al-Aqsa that I was working with every day, who saw their patients struggling with explosive injuries while also being skin and bones, right? So you're talking about people being pulled out of rubble or getting shot at, or a drone quadcopter hitting them, but they're already also skin and bones by the time it's April. By the time it's April, I'm doing interviews on Al Jazeera or whatever, what have you, telling sort of stats like 83% of the farmland is not cultivatable. 83% of fishing fleets are destroyed because of Israeli destruction. Like, we are living and breathing, while I was there, living and breathing, understanding what that looks like. What that looks like is the market price for tomatoes is skyrocketing. Like, what was once like a kilo of onions is now like a kilo of onions was once like $3. Now each onion is like its own like $3, right? Like each. So prices are fluctuating, but they're skyrocketing. There's not enough cash. I wasn't able to go into Gaza with more than $280. So even I don't have cash to work with to figure out how to get myself food. So I brought in a suitcase of tuna cans, which I passed out mostly to people. And so I lost 12 pounds while I was there. So living it and breathing it and experiencing it makes you kind of really understand that it is not happening to you. You are witnessing people's extreme they're being tortured. Like, there's no other way to say it. They're being tortured before your eyes. And so I was, there are community kitchens that I said, like before, they dwindled from 170 community kitchens when I first got there, or around maybe right before I got there, to it was dozens by the time it was May. They were losing food. There was nothing to work with. There were no community kitchens available. Everyone was begging all of the time. They were coming up to us in our we had our GLIA paraphernalia, or INGO sort of, stickers around what we were wearing or in our cars. And luckily, my colleagues and I speak Arabic, and it was easy to really connect and say, we don't have tahine either, we don't have flour either. Like we are both kind of struggling without supplies, right? Like even though I was probably in the most privileged possible position you can be in Gaza, I still didn't have supplies that were like in the kitchen. Like there was nothing that I was eating that I could share. There weren't supplies. Like I also had to go to the market and contend with high prices without cash, right? There's like
Yeah.
an unregulated network of cash brokers. The commission is high. The problems seemed like they were coming from every direction and that they were intentional, like Budur said. Like the whether it was the fact that there was only so much fresh produce or the fact that there was nothing on the market beyond cans of, very tuna cans that were $10 each or $15 each, flour that was hundreds of dollars to get, and then eventually there was no flour, and then eventually the GHF came, and then I had sources and colleagues trying to get food from the GHF and being shot at, having family being shot at, seeing patients at Nasser being shot deliberately in the back, seemingly sniped, right? Doctors had exorbitant amounts of evidence that showed that these were not accidental snipe shots. Like these were either, trying to corral people by shooting into the crowds, like sort of raining shots in, or they were very deliberate shots. But they would blame it on Hamas, but my sources didn't seem to have the same opinions, and continuously didn't blame Hamas, though they might have if it was Hamas. I don't think these people are particularly pro-Hamas or anti-Hamas. I think that they run the gamut. So what you would eventually hear is a lot of understanding of what is going on. Like everybody is hungry. Men who are unstable and who have weapons are going to be the first people who are bullying people for food. Like it isn't. We come to these things with a lot of we think we don't understand, but I think it's quite obvious and it's relatable. Like if you're going hungry for nearly a year and a half and acutely hungry since March 2nd, and it's now mid-June, there's a lot of people who are willing to do anything to get food for their children. And those people aren't even really the ones who are bullying people. It's the ones that are unstable mentally and psychologically, who have been going through so much torture for months, who are really bullying each other, and they're not necessarily linked to some. There is not some conspiracy here, like right, like we keep trying to make it Hamas this actor that, while Hamas is problematic in many ways for sure, and that there's a lot of people in Gaza who will speak on that, the ways that Israel speaks on Hamas isn't often the truth. It's often just some accusation to get away with their manufactured, the circumstances that are manufactured wholly by Israel itself. So being there from March 27th to June 3rd, I saw starvation develop between the people I was with. I was hungry myself. I ate once a day for a month and a half. That's hard, but it's a lot easier than eating once every few days, which is happening now for people that I know. And it's just like everyone has said before me, the amount of the task of rebuilding and giving reparations to the circumstances much more than just food. It has to be a coordinated effort by the entire world to flood Gaza with money and food to rebuild it and to help people medically, because there are no supplies. As a humanitarian aid worker who was going in and out of Aqsa and Nasser and the European Gaza hospital, often there are no supplies to help people, to help doctors do their job, right? Morphine wasn't always available for people with explosive injuries. Imagine that. The amount of pain people are just having to sort of deal with because they are hurt. I mean, the ways in which 20-year-old men are tasked with being the civil defense forces, just sitting with them and talking to them about their day-to-day and having to understand that they have to run into a site that has just been bombed and try to save as many people as possible within a certain amount of time before the second airstrike might hit the same area. The way in which this all felt deliberate became very real to me while I was there. We question a lot of nuance. We do a job that is important, which is being duly diligent and really questioning everything and trying to make sure that our maybe our accusations or our statements or the way that we see this happening is fair. But the truth is that when you're there, there's nothing about this that is fair. It is a genocide. It is intentional. There are several things happening at once on purpose, and there is a result of one group of people being tortured and eradicated. And I think that having been there and coming back, I think the one thing I really want to, hit home is that there is amidst all of this torture, amidst all of this pain, amidst all of this, Palestinians are still finding ways to be there for each other and fill in gaps that are impossible to fill. And I think that it is important to understand that when we come to this story, we come to it a lot of when I say we, I don't mean us as journalists, because I know that we are definitely far ahead of our audiences in terms of understanding what is going on because of our research. But we often come to this Palestine, we come to the story at a picture of a dead body. And I think that it's really tragic because all of these people are having vibrant experiences with one another, and it's being stolen. Like the beauty of Palestine is being stolen. And I think that we need to speak about it in that way, from that framework, that there is constantly, within every second that passes, more of Palestine is being robbed of itself. And there is so much vibrance and so much life and so much thankfulness and so much generosity happening every second there, that I think that it is a tragedy in and of itself to come to this subject from a place of just knowing how Palestinians are dying rather than knowing how Palestinians are living.
Thank you, Afif. Okay, we have 8 minutes left. There's so many questions, we're not going to be able to get to them. But I think we need to talk about what should be done, what needs to be done. One thing that you have argued, Professor DeWall, is that starvation imposes a moral imperative that transcends politics. When you talk about this issue, when I post about it in my social media, my Jewish friends who are supportive of the state of Israel get upset and they say, well, but Hamas inflicted, all of these hostages and all of these killings, and they post this information. They say starvation is not happening. It's really alarming to see that people are in this kind of denial, because of course they have their own point of view. But how should we deal with this issue? How as community journalists, as journalists who report to our own audiences in the United States, how should we deal with this?
So several points. Of course, two things can be true. Hamas can be terrible, and Israel can be terrible. So, what Hamas did on October 7th was unforgivable. The way it has treated hostages is also unforgivable. It doesn't, but why should the population of Gaza be punished for what Hamas did? It's just, I'm from a Jewish background myself. I'm from a Jewish family, and my values that I was brought up with, where my father, my grandmother, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, over generations, we had been displaced. We'd been victims of pogroms in Russia, of victims of the Nazis. And the values I was taught was that meant you had to stand up for humanity. And that was why I went to Sudan in 1984, in order to work with refugees and people who were suffering starvation. And I worked, personally. I risked my life to fight against the Islamists who are committing genocide in Sudan. And then to be told that I'm anti-Semitic because I'm doing the same thing, applying the same standards to Israel, I think I cannot accept. So the two things can be true. What needs to be done? If Israel has nothing to hide, it should allow in the journalists. It should allow in those who can gather the information. And then we will see who is telling the truth and who is lying. And what needs to be done? There are many famines around the world which are the responsibility of warlords, governments that are brutal, etc., etc. And Israel is not an exception in that regard. What is unusual, what is unique, is there is no other situation in which you have an aid system of the United Nations that has the resources, the capacity, the plans, the skills, everything which can act and solve and move. And to not allow it to do that it's criminal. There is no other way of describing that except as criminal. Last point, which is that the terrible tragedy is that had that system been activated fully in May, it would have prevented the current situation. Now we have two things. We have this escalating number of children with severe acute malnutrition who need to be in hospital. We need, intensive care units across Gaza. We need, the type of hospital care that I live in Boston, that you can get at Boston Children's Hospital, or you can get in Tel Aviv, transplanted to Gaza, en masse. That isn't going to happen through food. And the other problem is that when you get this degree of social chaos and breakdown, then it is even harder to put in place the basic infrastructure. You're muted.
I'm so sorry. So sorry. Badur, Hassan, I hope you're still with us. What would you have us do? Journalists working for community, newspapers, television, radio, online, here in the US, what would you have us do to shed light on this? What would you like for us to do?
So I would absolutely echo everything that Professor DeWall mentioned. Especially, I think we can't repeat this point enough. Yes, there has to be food in, and it's not just about number of trucks, and people have to be able to start repairing the damaged lands, especially crop lands. That would not be enough at this stage. At this stage, what is needed is a full-on recovery process. And I'm not even talking about the mental scars that have developed and that have emerged, and we don't even have, and I hate to use that word because it's never, but it's what people refer to, like we don't even have the luxury to talk about our emotions because we're so embroiled in the struggle for survival. And that would only start, parts of it began to surface during the ceasefire because finally people were able to start realizing the magnitude of what had been inflicted upon them. And then since March, this has even become worse. We're talking especially about the breakdown in social order and the maybe many years that it would take, especially if Israel continues to refuse to allow even the Palestinian Authority from operating in Gaza or any other alternative. I think also just one, and this is really important, and this is what journalists can and must do. And I know it's especially hard when Israel continues to block journalists and human rights investigators like myself. We at Amnesty are lucky because we have our field workers, trusted field workers, who themselves are, by the way, hungry and emaciated and still somehow incredibly, ridiculously working to document human rights violations. We as human rights investigators, our job is to do human rights work, but we find ourselves most of the day actually trying to do some humanitarian work, even from my place in Ramallah, helping to coordinate, to get food to some family, to get money to other families, to get something, logistics, work with our field workers in Gaza to do more humanitarian work than human rights work. Once journalists and human rights investigators are allowed into Gaza, then and forensic experts and forensic anthropologists and people who can look at and start analyzing and digging up and looking for and doing and DNA testing of those, like so many things that need to be done. But in terms of what journalists really need to do, there are so many different voices in Gaza that all need to be captured. Between March and May, early May, there were thousands of people protested in Beit Lahia, both against Israel genocide, but also against the practices, authoritarianism, corruption of Hamas as well. Beit Lahia, this beautiful city once called the city of cherries and berries, this city was completely flattened by Israel. and people were completely displaced, even though these people repeatedly came and said, we wanted peace, we wanted Hamas out. Many said we wanted Hamas out. And the city was completely razed. It was displaced in mass in May, and it's almost no longer, like there's not very few homes in Beit Lahiya are still standing. I think it's an imperative, a moral imperative on everyone covering Gaza to reflect this full spectrum of Gaza's humanity, and especially and please, and we need really to be careful when doing this on balancing, because it's really important to accentuate the level of destruction. And yes, we need to be uncomfortable. People need to see the uncomfortable images, even though they are graphic and it may pain them. Imagine if you are seeing them and getting emotional. What's about living them? But also, please respect the dignity of people in Gaza. That's so important. Like when we do the stories, when we write, when we cover, when we speak to the people, it's so easy. People keep saying, we are not beggars. We were forced to beg, but we are not beggars. And this insurmountable attempt by people to just preserve what is left of their dignity. And we really need to respect that. We really need to talk about respect. We need to use the right word. It's not a food crisis, it's starvation. It's not a war between Israel and Hamas, it's a genocide. And we really need to use the right words, the right framing, respectfully, respecting the dignity of the people, recognizing that, yes, as the Professor DeWall, both things can be right in the same time. Israel can be committing a genocide, and yes, it is committing a genocide. That doesn't mean, and there is also many mass violations being committed by Hamas, not just against hostages, by the way, but also particularly against Palestinians in Gaza. And even before the genocide, like for the 17 years in which Hamas had been in power in Gaza, people had protested, people said they were, it's just that the outside world were not interested to listening to the voices of people in Gaza unless there is war. What was happening between the wars, between the different military offensives, was rarely, if ever, listened to. And this is, I think, our obligation, like even once, and let's hope it comes soon, when the bombs cease to fall, when the situation, at least in terms of materially, improves, we have to keep our eyes on Gaza. We cannot afford to forsake this, because the implications, especially if Israel goes on with this plan to quote unquote take control, it's already in control, but at least ground control over Gaza City, where 1 million people live, where it's the very last remaining place for all those displaced from the north, the devastating consequences. It will take decades for people to heal, if at all, and we really should not forsake that. This should not become just any other journalistic trend. We really have to keep following with the stories, keep documenting, and I think, yeah, this is our moral obligation, and keep saying it. Like, it's not just a moral imperative on countries to stop what Israel is doing, it's a legal imperative. Countries that continue to allow to supply Israel with arms risk complicity in genocide and mass human rights violations, including war crimes, because starvation as a method of war is a war crime. So there is, in addition to the moral obligation, there is the legal obligation on these countries, and accountability, like even allowing more food and recognitions, whatever, they can never, ever, ever be alternatives to true justice and accountability.
Thank you, Budur. Thank you so much. We are over time. Quick, 30 seconds, Afif, you have the last word.
Yes,
Advice for your colleagues.
Yeah, I echo Budur for sure. There's a matter of respect when you're talking about this circumstance, which is genocide. It's genocide. It's not a war. It's using your language very clearly and carefully, and also reaching out to Palestinians and amplifying their voices. You can't do that enough. Like, you can't really tell this story without a lot of sources being the voice of your stories. Like, reach out, treat people with dignity and understanding that you would be in their position if the circumstances were switched, right? And think about how you treat the story as though you can relate to these people when you talk to them. I think that there's nothing more I can say than reaching out to Palestinians and amplifying real people in Gaza so that you can understand what their experiences are like on an intimate level. There is no other way to describe what's going on in Gaza without their voices being sort of front and center.
Thank you for all your voices and your knowledge and your everything that you've shared with us today. This was a very important briefing, and we appreciate Alex, we appreciate Badur, and we appreciate Afif being with us and helping us do a better job of reporting on this topic.